The Unexpected Bond. Ana estava totalmente isolada no coração da Serra da Mantiqueira em 1931. Abandonada por todos depois de enviuvar, sem uma única pessoa por perto, até o momento em que percebeu um barulho vindo de dentro da terra. Primeiro, um movimento pesado e arrastado. Depois, um lamento que soava quase humano, mas definitivamente não era. Você consegue imaginar passar a madrugada numa cabana velha de madeira no meio do nada absoluto e descobrir que alguma coisa ferida está te observando da escuridão logo embaixo dos seus pés? Parece impossível de acreditar, mas o que essa mulher descobriu no porão mudou absolutamente tudo. E o laço que surgiu ali entre a dor e o abandono vai te surpreender profundamente. Se você está gostando dessa história, deixa aquele like bem forte e me conta nos comentários de qual estado você está assistindo agora. Fico muito curioso para saber até onde essas narrativas incríveis conseguem chegar. Vamos lá, que essa história vai mexer com você de verdade. She was completely isolated in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains in 1931. Abandoned by everyone after becoming a widow, without a single soul nearby until she noticed a sound coming from deep within the earth. First, a heavy, dragging movement, then a lament that sounded almost human, but definitely wasn't. Can you imagine spending the night in an old wooden cabin in the absolute middle of nowhere and discovering something wounded is watching you from the darkness right beneath your feet? It seems impossible to believe, but what this woman discovered in the cellar changed everything, and the bond that emerged there between pain and abandonment will profoundly surprise you. If you're enjoying this story, give it a big thumbs up and tell me in the comments what state you're watching from right now. I'm very curious to know how far these incredible narratives can reach. Let's go, because this story is really going to move you. Mary Ann had been left behind like a broken object, a widow at 24, unable to have children, without receiving any inheritance, without a family willing to take her in again. In the deep rural Kentucky of the early 30s, a woman alone and without possessions was worth less than the stones that rolled downhill in the summer rains. Her husband, Robert, a calloused-handed worker with a generous smile, had lost his life in a terrible accident at the quarry where he'd been breaking stones since he was a boy, just 3 years after their marriage. The company that owned the quarry offered absolutely nothing, just a vague apology and a dry order for her to leave the small workers' house they shared. Robert's family, who came from another county, blamed Mary Ann for carrying bad luck, a curse that, according to them, had followed the young man into the depths of the rock. Her own family, ashamed and fearful of the same foolish superstition, turned their backs, offering only pitying glances that hurt more than any direct insult. The illness took Robert in a matter of days. It started with a very high fever, then came the uncontrollable tremors, the dark vomit, and finally the terrifying delirium. Mary Ann cared for him tirelessly until his last weak breath, but it was no use. Nothing she did was enough. And when Robert passed, she faced the harshest truth. He had left nothing but enormous debts. Debts with general stores, with farmers, even with the local church. The collectors didn't even have the decency to wait for the mourning period to end. They knocked on the door like hungry vultures over a fresh carcass. They wanted everything and took absolutely everything. The small house in the village where Mary Ann had dreamed of raising her children was the first thing to be taken. Then came the furniture for which she herself had sewn beautiful tablecloths, the iron pots that belonged to her grandmother, the chickens in the yard that laid eggs every morning. Even the old donkey Robert used to go to the fields was dragged away to settle a promissory note forgotten in a dusty drawer. In 3 weeks, Mary Ann found herself with absolutely nothing, literally stripped of everything. She slept at an acquaintance's house out of compassion, But compassion has an expiration date, especially when the recipient is still a young woman of pleasant appearance. Gossip began to circulate through the village. The glances of married men lingered too long. Wives began to lock their doors tightly. Mary Ann's family didn't even want to hear about her. Her father had passed away many years before, her mother soon after. She had 3 siblings, but all had migrated to Detroit in search of factory jobs and had cut all ties with the countryside. When Mary Ann sent a desperate letter asking for help, the response was cold and distant. They couldn't take her in. Everyone took care of their own, and that was that. It was in this moment of desperation that she learned about the property. A thin lawyer wearing a frayed black suit and round wire-rimmed glasses appeared at the house where she was temporarily staying. He carried papers yellowed by time and dampness. Robert, before he passed, had inherited a small property from a distant uncle he had never known personally. It was a house lost in the dense woods, nestled in the isolated mountains, a 4-day journey on foot from the nearest settlement. The lawyer made it clear from the start. Nobody wanted that forgotten place. It had been abandoned for over 12 years. A silent man, with skin marked by the sun and absolute indifference, led Mary Ann on a pack mule along a path that could barely be called a road. The journey lasted 4 full days, climbing narrow animal trails that snaked between deep ravines and fog-covered valleys, where the echo of her own footsteps was her only company. As they continued, the vegetation became wilder and denser, a barrier of thorns, giant ferns, and twisted trees that seemed to want to swallow the trail completely. The air grew thinner, imbued with the smell of eucalyptus and wet earth, and a silence that brought no peace, but rather an oppressive weight, as if something was waiting. With each passing hour, Mary Ann felt the familiar world disappear behind her like a dissolving mirage. She looked back countless times, watching the last smoke from a distant farm vanish, then the last patch of cornfields, until only the green and silent vastness of the mountains remained. The man who guided her spoke no more than 15 words throughout the entire journey. When they finally reached their destination, he pointed to a small cabin made of rough-hewn logs and mud, almost invisible, hidden among a cluster of ancient trees, and left without even accepting a glass of water, as if he feared the desolation of that place might cling to him. He wanted to get away as quickly as possible, and then Mary Ann was left alone, completely abandoned to her fate. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't truly a real silence. It was a strange symphony of unknown and unsettling sounds. The whistling of the wind between the enormous stones, the snapping of dry branches under the weight of some invisible creature, the distant hoot of an owl announcing the arrival of night. She turned to observe her new dwelling, and a painful tightness formed in her throat. The cabin was a complete ruin, built on a base of irregular stones to protect it from floods and nocturnal creatures, but now it seemed to be slowly sinking into the red clay. The mud walls were cracked with deep fissures through which the cold mountain wind seeped. The broken tile roof revealed the sky in several places, promising more water inside than out when the rainy season arrived. The rotten wooden door hung from a single dried leather hinge, creaking with every gust of wind like a perpetual groan of agony. She climbed the 4 stone steps with a caution that couldn't hide the tremor in her weak legs, testing each one before placing her full weight on it. She pushed the door, which let out a sharp, prolonged sound that echoed through the clearing and startled a flock of birds sleeping in nearby trees. Inside, the situation was even more desolate. The single room served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom. There was a wobbly table in a corner with 3 of its 4 legs broken, a cracked earthen stove full of cold ashes, and empty shelves that hung crookedly from the peeling walls. At the back, separated by a torn burlap curtain that no longer concealed anything, a broken bed frame on the dirt floor was all that remained of a bed. A thick layer of dust and spider cobwebs covered absolutely everything, hanging from the ceiling like sinister decorations. The air smelled of mold, rotten wood, of an abandonment that felt almost physical, like an invisible presence watching her from the deep shadows. Mary Ann dropped her small bundle on the dirt floor, a muffled sound that barely raised any dust. She sat on the edge of the rickety cot, feeling the cold of the earth seep through the thin fabric, and for the first time since the news of Robert's death had struck her like a freezing bolt, she allowed herself to cry uncontrollably. She wept with a silent, profound anguish, a river of tears that made no sound but carried the overwhelming weight of her shattered life. She cried for the husband who left too soon, for the family that rejected her, for a society that discarded her like a dry, infertile seed. She cried for the future she had imagined, a simple future of children playing in the yard and the smell of warm bread, a future that now seemed as distant and impossible as the stars beginning to appear through the holes in the broken roof. But tears, like rain in the desert, eventually run dry, for they do not rebuild fallen walls, nor clean years of grime, nor fill an empty, aching stomach. And in that moment of absolute desolation, Mary Ann understood something essential and definitive. Either she fought with the little energy she still possessed, or she would let herself die there in that cabin forgotten by time and men. There was no possible middle ground. No one would come to her rescue. It was her and only her against the daunting vastness of the Appalachian Mountains. Then, with a determination born of the purest desperation, she stood up. She wiped her face with the back of her dirty hand and began to work tirelessly. With a thick hickory branch, she swept the dirt floor, raising a cloud of dust that made her cough violently, but which, when it settled, revealed the firmness of the ground beneath. She tore down the cobwebs that hung like funeral shrouds, fixed the door as best she could, using a strip of leather from her own bag to secure the broken hinge. She patched the larger cracks in the mud walls with a mixture of red clay and dry grass she found in a dark corner, an old remedy her maternal grandmother had taught her as a child. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, a small gesture of resistance against total abandonment. Night fell over the Appalachian Mountains with frightening speed, a blanket of darkness so complete it seemed to have its own substance. It wasn't like in the Kentucky settlement, where the kerosene lamps of men returning from night work and the candles in windows offered a flickering comfort against the gloom. Here there was absolutely nothing, just the impenetrable blackness of the dense woods. She lit the only candle she had, a small stub that would have to last who knew how long. She ate a piece of dry molasses candy and drank water from a nearby stream that she had boiled with apprehension, fearful of the diseases lurking in stagnant waters. Then she lay on the hard cot, covered herself with the thin shawl that smelled of smoke and solitude, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come at all. Every sound of the night made her jump in fright. The whistling wind seeping through the cracks in the mud walls, the rustling of dry leaves outside, the distant howl of a wolf that sent shivers down her spine. Every shadow cast by the faint candlelight seemed to take on menacing forms, monsters born of fear and exhaustion. She tried to think of Robert, of the warmth of his embrace, of his laughter that seemed to fill any room. But the memories felt distant, fragile, as if they belonged to another existence, another woman. She was almost succumbing to exhaustion when she heard it, a completely different sound coming from the stone cellar that opened in the floor, covered by a heavy, worm-eaten wooden trapdoor. At first, it was a muffled scratch, almost inaudible, as if a tiny stone rolled across the hard ground. Marianne thought it was her tired imagination. Terror, she told herself, is a painter that creates ghosts on the canvas of darkness. But then the noise returned, clearer this time, a heavy, laborious dragging, as if something large and heavy was moving with extreme difficulty across the dirt floor of the dark cellar. She lay motionless on the old cot, holding her breath tightly, her heart pounding in her ears with the force of a tribal drum. She listened with an attention that physically and mentally hurt, trying to decipher the origin of that strange sound. Deep silence. Nothing more. Perhaps it was just a small animal, a raccoon or an opossum seeking shelter from the biting cold of the night. She tried to calm herself, to convince herself that she was protected. But then another sound came, and this one left no room for doubt. It was a low, guttural, drawn-out moan, a lament that seemed to emanate from the depths of the red clay. It wasn't the growl of a wild beast, but something more disturbing, something that echoed human suffering, the kind of sound that imprints itself on memory as a sign of mortal danger, an ancestral warning that death lurks nearby. Marianne pulled her thin shawl up to her chin, clutching tightly the small knife she always carried. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt it would explode in her chest. The minutes dragged like eternal hours in the absolute darkness. The noise didn't return, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she hadn't imagined a thing. There was something in the cellar below, something large, something groaning in intense pain. She didn't sleep a wink all night. She lay there stiff as a stone, eyes wide open, listening to every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of the wind in the trees, waiting for dawn like a shipwrecked sailor awaits the sight of land on the horizon. When the first timid rays of sun filtered through the cracks in the mud wall, dimly illuminating the interior of the cabin, Marianne got up, her body aching and her mind completely exhausted. She left the house, walked around, inspecting everything carefully. The wooden stilts created a gap of almost 5 feet between the ground and the broken floorboards. It was dark down there. She crouched cautiously. She tried to see something, but only saw shadows and red clay. Nothing. No sign of an animal, no visible trace. Maybe she really had imagined it all. Extreme tiredness, constant fear, overwhelming solitude. All of it could be playing tricks on her mind. Marianne tried to convince herself of this with all her might. She spent the entire day reinforcing the mud patch on the cracked walls, searching for wild edible roots, and carrying water from the distant stream, an arduous journey along a nearly invisible trail. She kept herself busy so as not to think too much, so as not to feel the crushing weight of solitude that enveloped her like a heavy shroud. She tried to drown out the memory of the sound with the thud of her hands against the damp mud walls, the splashing of water in the clay pitcher. But when night returned, bringing with it the biting cold of the Appalachian Mountains, the sound also returned with it. This time it was earlier, exactly as the last orange glow of the sun disappeared behind the distant mountain peaks. Marianne heard the dragging again, closer, more distinct and clear. There was no longer any room for doubt. It wasn't her tired imagination. There was definitely something down there. She stood paralyzed in the middle of the dark cabin, the small candle she held trembling in her hand, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her terror. The dragging continued for an agonizing moment, a slow, drawn-out sound, and then stopped abruptly. And then a new, disturbing sound arrived, a heavy, panting breath, as like that of an exhausted animal after a long, desperate run. A deep, broken gasp, that seemed to fight for every gulp of air. It was the sound of extreme difficulty, of supreme effort to keep living. It was the sound of a gravely wounded creature. Mary Ann set the candle on the dirt floor, grabbed her small knife, and slowly crawled to the edge of the wooden trapdoor that covered the entrance to the dark cellar. She lay prone on the cold earth and tried to peer through one of the wider cracks between the old planks. She couldn't see anything but an impenetrable, heavy darkness, but the sounds were present, right below her, so close she could feel a slight vibration in the hard ground. And then she heard something that made her tremble to her soul. A low moan laden with unbearable pain. It wasn't a sound of direct threat. It was a sound of pure suffering. Whatever was down there was gravely injured, and for some inexplicable reason had chosen the space beneath her cabin as a last refuge before death. Mary Ann moved away from the crack and sat leaning against the cold wall. Her mind raced frantically in all directions. What should she do now? Try to scare the creature away? What if it was dangerous and would attack her mercilessly? She spent another night completely awake, and the next morning, exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes and her hands trembling from fatigue, Mary Ann made an important decision. She needed to see what it was. She needed to know what she was sharing that space with, because the uncertainty was killing her as much as any animal could. She waited until the sun was high in the clear sky. She grabbed a torch she had carefully prepared, a thick branch with oil-soaked rags tied to the end. She lit it with the candle, took the knife in her other hand, and crawled to the side opening of the house, the gap between the first post and the red clay. Mary Ann's heart pounded so hard she could violently hear the blood pulsing in her ears. Her hands were cold with sweat. Her mouth was completely dry. Every part of her body screamed at her to go back, not to do it, to leave things as they were. But she pressed on, knelt, and with an effort that made her groan aloud, pushed the heavy wooden trapdoor aside. The smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sickly, rose from the dark cellar. She held her breath and thrust the torch into the black hole. The yellowish, flickering light danced in the deep shadows, revealing the stone walls and the dirt floor. And it was then that she saw them clearly, two golden, gleaming circles staring at her from the bottom of the cellar. Large, feverish eyes that reflected the torchlight like two polished gold nuggets. Mary Ann almost dropped the torch, almost screamed in despair, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was natural curiosity, or perhaps the pure shock of the situation, but she stood there, her heart hammering in her throat, her gaze fixed on those unblinking eyes. She moved the torch slowly, illuminating more of the confined space, and the creature fully revealed itself, sending a cold shiver down her spine. It was a cougar, an immense animal, much larger than she had ever imagined possible, with thick fur in golden and brownish tones, stained with dirt and something dark that looked like dried blood. But what captured Mary Ann's complete attention was not its imposing size, nor the evident strength that could be guessed in its now tense and exhausted muscles. It was the terrible state it was in. The cougar lay on its side, its chest rising and falling with each labored, gasping breath. One of its hind legs was caught in a rusty steel trap, one of those farmers set to protect livestock from predators of the mountains. The trap had bitten deep, very deep indeed. The flesh around it was torn, exposed, and darkened by dry, clotted blood. In some places, the white, splintered bone was clearly visible. The infection had already begun its silent, deadly advance. Yellowish, thick pus oozed from the open wound, impregnating the air with a sweet and rotten smell. The cougar looked at her, and that gaze pierced her to the depths of her soul. It was not the gaze of a predator carefully studying its prey. It was not the gaze of a wild animal about to attack. It was a look of pure and complete exhaustion, of boundless pain, of a despair so profound it seemed to have extinguished every spark of life. It was the look of someone who had given up, who was just waiting for death to come and end their interminable suffering. Mary Ann recognized that look because she herself had worn it on her own face for weeks when she lost absolutely everything, when she believed there was nothing left to live for. It was the look of total and complete abandonment. The cougar didn't even try to growl or show its sharp fangs. It simply watched her as if silently saying, "Do what you want with me. I'm too tired to care." Mary Ann retreated slowly, very slowly, moving away from the mouth of the cellar and returning to the weak daylight. She was trembling violently, but it was no longer just pure fear. It was something deeper and more complex, an emotion she couldn't quite name. She went back inside the cabin and sat on the dirt floor with the torch still lit in her hand, its flame flickering like the beating of her own frightened heart. There was a cougar under her house, gravely wounded, slowly agonizing. The most basic logic, the most primitive survival instinct screamed at her to close the trapdoor, to put heavy stones on it, to flee without looking back. But for some absurd and inexplicable reason, Mary Ann couldn't simply ignore what she had seen with her own eyes. She tried to do that. She spent the rest of the day trying to focus on other urgent things. She reinforced the broken roof with branches and fresh mud. She washed her only change of clothes in the icy stream. She carefully boiled water to drink. But the image of those golden eyes wouldn't leave her mind, and the groans of pain, though weaker and more sporadic, continued to rise from the depths of the earth, a constant reminder of the agony unfolding just beneath her. As evening fell, Mary Ann did something she herself didn't fully comprehend. She took a piece of cured pork she had brought in her bundle. It was almost all the food she had left, one of the few things she had to survive in that God-forsaken place. But she broke off a generous piece anyway. She lit the torch again, descended to ground level, and with her heart in her throat, approached the opening of the dark cellar. She didn't dare to enter completely. Instead, she used a long stick to push the meat into the darkness, near where she had seen the injured cougar. The animal, which had been motionless until then, raised its head with visible and painful effort, sniffed the air, its nostrils trembling slightly. There was a moment of hesitation, a palpable tension in the stuffy air, but hunger, a force as primordial as fear, spoke louder. The cougar painfully dragged itself towards the meat and devoured it with a slowness that revealed its extreme weakness, chewing with evident difficulty. Mary Ann watched in absolute silence and then carefully retreated. She went back inside the cabin and for the first time in days felt something different besides loneliness, because now, in some strange and illogical way, she wasn't just fighting for her own life, she was caring for someone, even if that someone was one of the most feared predators of the mountains. Mary Ann realized that the animal had been starving for a long time, probably entire days, perhaps full weeks, trapped in that snare before managing to drag itself there. Hunger had exhausted its strength as much as the horrible wound. Feeding the cougar was not enough at all. The wound was rapidly infecting. Mary Ann could see it clearly. The swelling increased each day. The smell was starting to get strong and nauseating, a sweet and putrid odor of flesh rotting alive. If nothing was done soon, the cougar would die of septicemia in a few days, even if Mary Ann fed it religiously. And that's when Mary Ann faced an impossible and terrifying decision. She could try to treat the injured cougar, but that would mean getting dangerously close. It meant touching the animal, a wild predator, in its most vulnerable and therefore most unpredictable state. It meant trying to manipulate the steel trap, an act that would undoubtedly cause unbearable pain to the cougar. And the animal, even in its agony, still had claws and fangs capable of tearing a human to shreds in seconds. The other option was to do absolutely nothing, to let nature take its cruel course, for the infection to consume the animal until its heart finally stopped beating. She could close the trap door, ignore the moans, and wait for silence to reign again under her cabin. It was the logical option, the safe and sensible option. But every time she heard that low, mournful whimper, something inside her, something she didn't fully understand, refused to accept that easy way out. It was as if the cougar's suffering had intertwined with her own. Two solitudes, two abandonments meeting in the deep darkness. She couldn't just let that creature die like that, alone and in terrible agony. She remembered her childhood on her father's farm, long before the quarry and the settlement took away her simple dreams. She recalled her father carefully treating the animals on the property, a horse with a hurt leg, a pet dog bitten by a venomous snake. He had taught her the secrets of the wilderness, the silent language of plants. He had shown her how to find marigold to reduce swelling and pain, how to scrape the bark of witch hazel to create a resin that sealed wounds and warded off evil spirits. She remembered the smell of the St. John's wort infusion, which her father prepared as a natural painkiller for injured animals, a bitter but very effective concoction. She had learned to clean deep wounds, to prepare healing poultices, to understand the delicate balance between healing and causing more harm. This knowledge, which had remained dormant in a forgotten corner of her memory, now awoke with an unexpected and powerful urgency. It was a true inheritance, a legacy from her father that, at that moment, felt like the only real tool she possessed in the entire world. With this certainty rooting itself in her wounded heart, she made a firm decision. Mary Ann went out into the Appalachian Mountains, carefully traversing paths she barely remembered. She searched for specific plants, her eyes scanning the forest floor with a concentration that erased her fear. She found a bed of yellow marigold flowers growing sheltered by some enormous rocks. Further on, she identified a witch hazel tree by its reddish, aromatic bark and scraped off a bit with her knife. Finally, near the creek, she found St. John's wort with its small green leaves and characteristic pungent smell. She collected everything with extreme care, thanking the earth for its generosity, as her father had taught her as a child. She returned to the cabin and began preparing the natural remedies. She boiled water in her only cracked clay pot, preparing a concentrated infusion with the pain-relieving herb, then pounded the marigold flowers on a smooth stone until they became a thick orange paste. She mixed the witch hazel resin with a bit of clean ash to create a sealing ointment. When everything was ready and arranged, she took the cleanest cloths she had, soaked them in the warm infusion, and, taking several deep breaths, headed once more toward the dark mouth of the cellar. The cougar remained lying in the exact same position, a heap of fur and pain in the damp gloom. Its trapped paw now stood out, swollen and a dark, feverish red. Mary Ann knelt at the edge of the cellar, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. With infinite slowness, she extended the stick with the soaked cloths until they were close to the injured animal's muzzle. The cougar weakly lifted its head, its ears flattened against its skull in a clear sign of distrust. A low, hoarse growl vibrated in its muscular chest. It sniffed the wet cloths, its black, damp nose trembling slightly. The bitter smell of the herb must have been repulsive, but the animal licked the cloth once with clear hesitation. Perhaps instinct or pure thirst compelled it to continue. It licked the liquid until the cloths were almost completely dry, absorbing the natural painkiller her father had taught her to prepare so many years ago. Marianne waited, holding her breath, observing every minimal movement of the injured animal. 20 minutes, 30, 40, which seemed like a complete eternity. Little by little, the cougar seemed to visibly relax. Its breathing became slower and deeper, less ragged and desperate. The tense muscles of its body seemed to gradually loosen. The pain-relieving effect was working perfectly. And then Marianne did the bravest or most foolish thing of her entire life. She left the lit torch wedged in a crack in the stone wall to illuminate the confined space. And, with the knife in one hand and the marigold paste in the other, she slid into the dark cellar. She moved with a snail's slowness, crawling on her belly until she was close enough to touch the cold trap. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold things. Her heart beat so wildly she felt she might faint at any moment. The cougar watched her intently. Those golden, feverish eyes fixed on her, following each of her movements with attention. It no longer growled, but its body was rigid, a statue of extreme pain and tension. Marianne reached the cruel trap. The metal was hot, heated by the sun that had beaten down on the ground all day. It was rusty and dirty, but still very strong. She held it with both trembling hands, located the oxidized release mechanism, and began to force it with all her energy. The trap was heavy and tough, made to hold large wild animals, not to be easily opened by weak human hands. Marianne grunted with a tremendous effort. The muscles in her arms burned like fire. Her hands slipped on the cold metal, but she kept forcing without stopping. With an effort that made her groan aloud in pain, she used both hands to try to pry open the steel jaws. The trap was too heavy, built to hold a strong, wild creature, not to be easily opened by a woman alone. Marianne grunted with superhuman effort, the muscles of her arms burning like embers, her hands slipping on the rusty, dirty metal. The cougar let out a low, painful moan when the pressure moved its injured paw. For a paralyzing instant, panic completely overwhelmed her. She waited for the fatal attack, the sharp claws, the deadly fangs. But the attack didn't come. The cougar merely stared at her, its eyes filled with a suffering that transcended the barrier between species. With a new wave of absolute determination, Marianne tried again, using the full weight of her slender body. And then, with a dry, metallic snap that echoed in the small confined space, the trap sprang open completely. The cougar let out a sharp cry, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the entire Appalachian Mountains and made Marianne fall backward, her heart racing uncontrollably. She waited for the violent attack. She waited for the deadly claws, but the attack didn't come. The cougar lay there panting, its paw free but bloody, trembling without pause. It turned its head towards Marianne, and for a second, just a fleeting second, their eyes met deeply. And Marianne swore she saw something in that animal's gaze. Clear recognition, perhaps even genuine gratitude. She wasted no precious time. Before her courage could slip away like water through her fingers, before reason screamed at her to flee in desperation, Marianne took the clay pot with clean water she had boiled, and with a delicacy that contradicted the trembling of her injured hands, began to wash the exposed wound. The cougar shivered violently. A low, pained growl vibrated in its broad chest, but it did not move an inch. Its golden eyes, now clouded by intense pain, followed her every careful movement, a strange mix of fear and unexpected submission. Marianne cleaned the dried blood, the yellowish pus, the accumulated dirt of days. The wound was worse than it looked from afar. It was too deep, and as she cleaned it, she could see that the bone in its paw was chipped, an ugly fracture that would probably never fully heal. But at least now it was free from the steel trap that had been slowly and mercilessly killing it. With her fingertips, she applied the marigold paste directly onto the exposed raw flesh. The cougar trembled violently all over. A spasm of pain coursed through its powerful body, but it remained still, as if it understood that this was absolutely necessary. Then, with extreme care, she spread witch hazel resin over it, creating a thick, protective layer. Finally, with strips of clean cloth torn from her own skirt and soaked in boiled water, she bandaged the paw as best she could, tying it without tightening too much, just enough to keep the dressing in place. When she was completely finished, Marianne was drenched in sweat, despite the intense cold of the damp cellar. Her hands were stained with blood and sticky resin. Her heart still pounded uncontrollably in her tight chest. She retreated with the same extreme slowness with which she had entered, without taking her eyes off the injured cougar. She gathered her things and went back up to the cabin, closing the trapdoor behind her, but this time without placing anything heavy on top of it. She felt completely exhausted, as if she had fought a battle not against the animal, but against her own paralyzing fear. And that night, for the first time since she had arrived at the abandoned cabin, she slept deeply, a dreamless sleep, lulled by extreme exhaustion. And there were no moans of pain rising from the cellar, only the sound of the wind in the tall trees, which no longer sounded like a mournful lament, but like a soft lullaby. Days turned into weeks, and something extraordinary and unexpected began to happen. The cougar's wound began to heal slowly, but steadily and visibly. Marianne changed the dressing every day without fail. At first, the cougar would stiffen every time she approached, a low, threatening growl vibrating in its throat, but it never attacked. As time passed, it simply lay there, allowing Marianne to work as if it understood that this strange human was somehow helping it to survive. The cougar also began to eat the cured meat she left every morning and every evening without fail. It regained some of the weight it had lost during its suffering. Its coat, once dull and matted by its ordeal, began to shine again with golden tones under the torchlight, and it began to move more easily. First, it just dragged itself a few inches to reach the food and fresh water. Then it stood up with visible effort, leaning on 3 strong paws. Finally, it managed to walk with a visible limp, but walk it did. And it was then that things became even more surprising and inexplicable. One clear morning, Marianne woke up and heard a strange noise just outside her old door. She opened it with extreme care and found a dead raccoon on the doorstep, freshly hunted, still warm, with fang marks on its thick neck. She looked around, surprised, and saw the cougar a few yards away, sitting on its hind legs, watching her intently. When their gazes met, the cougar emitted a low, non-threatening sound, almost like a greeting, and then turned and limped back to its refuge under the old cabin. Marianne stood there looking at the dead raccoon and understood perfectly. The cougar had hunted and brought her the prey. It was its way of reciprocating, its way of saying thank you. It was a silent pact, sealed not with human words, but with an act of shared survival. This repeated every few days with regularity. A new gift appeared on the doorstep, a groundhog, a quail, even a small badger. The cougar was hunting again, regaining its natural skills and sharing the food with Marianne. and she accepted gratefully because now, ironically, that wild predator was ensuring her survival as much as she had ensured its. They developed a silent and comfortable routine, an understanding that needed no spoken words. The cougar would leave at dawn to hunt in the woods. It would return at noon, always limping a little, always favoring its injured paw, but growing stronger and more agile with each passing day. It drank water from the icy stream, rested in the cool shade of the cellar. And in the afternoon, when Marianne went out to collect firewood or look for medicinal plants, the cougar would follow her at a safe distance, a golden shadow moving among the dense trees. Never too close, but close enough for her to feel its constant presence, as if it were watching, protecting. Marianne found herself talking to the animal regularly. Nonsense, really. Comments about the changing weather, about how the roof still needed more repairs, about how nice it would be to have a thicker blanket for the harsh winter that was approaching. And the cougar listened, lying in the shade, its eyes half closed, its tail occasionally moving from side to side. It was impossible. It was completely absurd, but it was happening. A woman society had discarded and a predator nature had almost eliminated had formed an improbable and profound bond, a bond based on mutual need, shared loneliness, and pure survival. And if you're enjoying this incredible story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any exciting narratives like this one. Tell me in the comments too, would you have had the courage to do what Marianne did? Would you have risked everything to save a life, even if it was a wild predator? I'm very curious to know your honest opinion. And let's continue, because the most impactful part is yet to come. But good things, especially in the isolated Appalachian Mountains, never last forever. 3 months after Marianne's arrival, while repairing one of the mud walls that had cracked again, she heard distant voices, human voices, for the first time. For the first time since she had arrived at that place, a different chill ran down her spine. The cougar resting under the cabin also heard them clearly. It leaped from its refuge, ears perked, its whole body tense, a low, threatening growl vibrating in its broad chest. Men appeared in the small clearing, 5 of them, with wide-brimmed hats, shotguns slung over their shoulders, and skin marked by the harsh sun, farmers by their leather clothes and worn boots, professional hunters by the cold, calculating gaze with which they swept the entire area. They stopped abruptly upon seeing Marianne alone there. The leader, a robust man with a thick, grizzled beard, took off his hat in an exaggerated and sarcastic bow. "Good afternoon, ma'am. We weren't expecting to find no one in this forgotten corner of the world." Marianne remained by the door of the old cabin, her hand gripping the rotting wooden doorframe. "Good afternoon," she replied, her voice firm despite her pounding heart. "This is my property. Can I help you with something?" The men exchanged glances, sneering smiles appearing on their sun-baked faces. These were not friendly smiles at all. "Your property," one of them said, spitting on the dry ground. "A woman alone in the middle of nowhere. How fearless," he scoffed. The leader let out a short, dry laugh. "Fearless or crazy, I couldn't say for sure. We're after a cougar, a big beast that killed several of my sheep and severely wounded 2 of my guard dogs. We lost our trail a few weeks ago, but yesterday we found fresh tracks around here. Tracks too big, definitely hers." Marianne's heart stopped for a second. She kept her expression completely neutral, a mask of indifference she'd learned to wear since she was very young. "I haven't seen any cougar around here," she said with a calm she didn't feel inside. The man smiled wider, a twisted grimace that didn't reach his cold, hard eyes. "Oh no? How strange then." His voice dripped with sarcasm. because the tracks lead straight to your door and then vanish as if the creature evaporated into thin air or burrowed into the ground. Another one of the hunters, a younger, thin man, pointed the barrel of his old rifle at the wooden cellar door. "Look, boss, the tracks end right here, and there are dried bloodstains on the wood." Mary Ann's heart gave a painful leap. She stood firm with her chin raised, though inside she felt like she was falling apart. "I'm telling you, there's nothing here. Maybe it was a bobcat or it went into a den. The Appalachian Mountains are vast." The leader stepped forward, completely invading her personal space, his shadow covering her entirely. "Look here, ma'am," he said in a falsely patient tone. "We know the cougar is here and we want it. This beast cost us money and trouble. We're not leaving empty-handed because of a stubborn woman." Her patience had completely run out. With a curt nod, the other men began to surround the cabin, their heavy boots crushing the dry grass. One of them walked directly to the cellar door and, without asking permission, lifted it with the tip of his rusty rifle. He peered into the darkness. A second of tense, agonizing silence passed, and then the man let out a triumphant, loud exclamation. "Here's the damned beast! It's right down here!" And then everything happened too fast. Before the men could react in any way, a golden shadow emerged from the darkness of the cellar like lightning. It didn't bolt and run. It didn't flee cowardly. The cougar simply walked towards the sunlight, visibly limping, but with a fierce and impressive dignity. It positioned itself between Mary Ann and the armed hunters, planting its 3 healthy paws firmly on the hard ground. It lowered its head menacingly, the fur on its back stood on end, and a low, threatening growl rumbled from deep in its chest, revealing long, yellowish fangs. The hunters instinctively recoiled, surprised by the audacity of the wounded animal. They raised their rifles in unison, the metallic sound of triggers being cocked, breaking the heavy silence of the Appalachian Mountains. The leader aimed directly at the cougar's chest. "Now you've got it, you damned beast," he yelled furiously. But before he could pull the trigger, a desperate cry cut through the clean air. "Don't shoot, please." Mary Ann rushed down the stone steps and without a second thought placed herself in front of the cougar, spreading her arms to protect it. The men gaped, their rifles still aimed, but now hesitant. "Get out of the way, woman," the leader ordered angrily. "This beast needs to die. She's dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Mary Ann replied, her voice trembling but firm. "She's wounded. I saved her. She hasn't attacked anyone since she's been with me." "Saved her?" the man scoffed. "Are you crazy? She's a wild cougar. She'll kill you as soon as she regains her strength." "No, she won't," Mary Ann said with absolute conviction. "She brought me food. We helped each other. We are companions." The hunters exchanged incredulous glances. The leader slowly lowered his rifle, studying Mary Ann with a new look, a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. "Are you really defending an animal that killed my cattle?" "She was hungry and wounded," Mary Ann argued, "trapped in that horrible snare. She had no choice, and ever since I freed her, she hasn't attacked anything but wild animals for food. Leave her alone, please. She won't bother anyone anymore." There was a long, tense silence. The leader looked at the cougar, which remained motionless behind Mary Ann, still growling low but not advancing. He looked at Mary Ann, saw the unwavering determination in her eyes. Finally, he sighed heavily and spat on the ground in disgust. "You're crazy, woman, completely crazy," he said, shaking his head. "But I won't kill a beast right under the nose of someone who saved it. That would be too dishonorable. Just know that if she attacks my sheep again, I'll be back here and finish the job. Understood?" Mary Ann nodded quickly, relieved. "Understood. Thank you. She won't cause any more trouble, I promise." The hunters slowly lowered their weapons, still suspicious. They turned and began to walk away down the narrow trail. The leader stopped one last time and looked back. "You've got courage, I'll give you that. But courage and madness sometimes go hand in hand. Be careful." And then they vanished among the dense trees, their heavy footsteps fading until silence reigned again in the clearing. Marianne let out the breath she'd been holding, her legs trembling so much she almost fell. She turned to the cougar, which was still tense and alert. Their eyes met once more, and Marianne slowly, hesitantly, extended her hand. The cougar watched her for a long moment, then, surprisingly, approached and rested its head in Marianne's palm for the first time. It was a soft, warm touch, full of a meaning that transcended any language. Marianne felt tears stream down her face as she stroked the soft golden fur. "We're in this together now," she whispered with a choked voice. "You and I, two survivors." The following months were the strangest and at the same time the most fulfilling of Marianne's life. The cougar fully recovered from her wound, though her paw never quite returned to normal. She limped when she walked, but that didn't stop her from hunting efficiently, and she continued to bring food to Marianne religiously, ensuring they both had something to eat. Their routine established itself naturally. The cougar would go out to hunt at dawn and return at midday to rest in the shade. Marianne took care of the cabin, collected plants, kept everything in order. In the afternoons, they often walked together through the Appalachian Mountains, the cougar always a few feet away, but always present, always vigilant. It was a silent yet profound companionship. Marianne talked to her about everything, about her memories of Robert, about her fears, her dreams, and the cougar listened, lying in the sun, her golden eyes half closed, her tail moving gently. Winter arrived with full force, bringing torrential rains and intense cold. But Marianne was no longer alone. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled like a wounded wolf, the cougar would come up to the cabin and lie down near the earthen stove, her immense warmth heating the small room. Marianne would sit beside her, her back leaning against the animal's warm body, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. The people from the nearest settlement eventually heard about the woman who lived with a cougar. Some called her a witch, others crazy, but some, the wisest among them, called her a healer, a woman who understood the language of animals and nature. Occasionally, someone would climb the Appalachian Mountains looking for help, someone with a sick or injured animal, and Marianne would help them, using the knowledge her father had taught her and that the cougar had helped her recall. The cougar never again attacked anyone's livestock. It seemed to understand, in some mysterious way, that this would put Marianne in danger. It hunted only in the deep woods, far from the farms, and always shared its prey with the woman who had saved it. Years passed in this strange and beautiful way. Marianne grew old in the Appalachian Mountains, her skin weathered by the sun, her hands calloused by work. But she never again felt alone or abandoned. The cougar also grew old, its movement slowed, its fur gained streaks of gray. But they remained together, two solitary souls who had found solace in each other. When the cougar finally passed, many years later, it was peacefully lying in the sun at the cabin entrance, its head in Marianne's lap. Marianne buried it in a beautiful clearing full of wildflowers, marking the spot with a smooth stone. And though her heart ached with the loss, she knew she had been blessed. She had experienced something rare and precious, a connection that defied all logic, but was more real than anything she had ever lived. Marianne continued living in the Appalachian Mountains until her last days. The people who visited her said she still talked to herself as if someone invisible were by her side. And on full moon nights, they swore they heard a soft purr echoing through the Appalachian Mountains, as if the cougar was still there, watching over its human friend. The story of Marianne and the cougar became a legend in the region. It was told around campfires, passed down from generation to generation, a story about how loneliness can be transformed into companionship, about how compassion can create improbable bonds, about how two wounded beings can heal each other when the whole world abandons them. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if we are human or animal, we all need someone. We all need to know that we are not alone in this vast and sometimes cruel world. And sometimes that someone appears in the most unexpected way, coming from the most unlikely places, teaching us that love and loyalty know no borders or species. And this is the story of Marianne and the cougar who changed each other's lives forever. A story of survival, of courage, of a bond that was born of pain but blossomed into something beautiful and eternal. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched mine in telling it, please subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming narratives like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a memorable experience with an animal? Have you ever felt that deep connection that needs no words? Share your story with us, because this community is made of real and touching stories from people like you. And most importantly, what did you learn from Marianne's journey? Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected places. Warm regards, and until the next incredible story.